오늘은 제임스 레니 강좌 8번째가 되겠습니다. 빅토리아 유니버시티 오브 알링턴의 벤 잭슨 교수가 강의할 예정입니다. 아시아 태평양에서 인도-태평양으로 미국이 새로운 전략의 추구가 정말 실현 가능한가, 가능성과 한계는 무엇인가를 다룰 것입니다. 벤 잭슨 교수는 상당히 진보적인 학자입니다. 지금까지는 우리가 대부분 미국에서 주류 학자들을 모셨는데 이 벤 잭슨 교수는 아주 젊고 새롭게 부각되고 있는 젊고 새롭게 부상하는 진보적인 학자여서 미국의 다양한 시각을 배울 수 있는 좋은 기회가 될 것이라고 생각합니다. 기대해 주십시오. Welcome to the 8th James Laney lecture. Today's lecture topic is From Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, Promises and Limitations. Now, that's a very important topic, and we have accepted, Indo-Pacific strategy without any criticism, and now Indo-Pacific strategy has become new paradigm in our region. But we have many questions about Indo-Pacific strategy. Okay, Asia is missing, and also Asia-Pacific strategy has been working very well, and it seems to be too premature to change Asia-Pacific paradigm into Indo-Pacific paradigm. I had all sort of, those kinds of questions regarding American shift to Indo-Pacific. And with regard to this topic, I am very lucky to have Professor Van Jackson of Victoria University of Wellington. I was impressed by Professor Van Jackson all the time. Okay, I usually use 3 P's to describe him. He is a prolific writer, and he is provocative in thinking, and he is very pragmatic in solving the problems. Therefore, I usually use 3 P's to describe Professor Van Jackson, and you'll find why he's so popular throughout Asia Pacific, even in Europe too. He is prolific because he has written so far 5 books, 2 books on Korea, and 1 book on Asia Pacific, is the Pacific Power Paradox by Yale University Press. And this year he published in a Grand Strategies of the Left. There is another controversial in a book, which really make a very deep look into the historical evolution of American foreign policy. I read the book and with great interest. Okay, I read those 2 books with great interest, Pacific Power Paradox and the Grand Strategies of the Left. And another book will be coming out of Cambridge University Press, hopefully this year or no later than, next year. The title of the new book is Rivalry Parallel, and it's about China-US relations, a great power competition. And when book is out, that I will announce to all of you. Anyhow, today, Professor Jackson will give about 20 to 25, minute lecture. That will be followed by about 25 to 30 minute conversation between him and me, and then I will open to the floor. The product of this lecture will be reproduced in several forms. First, there will be a YouTube video form that can be widely shared throughout the world, and also we'll be publishing book in Korean and English. And then Professor Jackson's chapter will be included in both Korean version and English version. Okay, with a brief introduction, let me invite Professor Jackson to give a lecture.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the generous introduction too. And for having me come speak today. So I guess I'm here to talk a little bit about what is gained and what is lost when we think about a region in a certain way. So East Asia is the core region when we talk about quote unquote Asia. But as conflict and geopolitical confrontation starts to put pressures on East Asian international relations, that ends up having spillover effects that bleed into the Blue Pacific region and the Indian Ocean region. And both of those areas are regions in their own right, but they're obviously regions that are on the periphery of East Asia, just as East Asia is on their periphery. And the reason I mention this is because all of it is askew of, or even erased by, imagining a so-called Indo-Pacific. So when we see governments start to refer to an Indo-Pacific rather than an Asia-Pacific or an East Asia, or whatever else, frankly, what we're seeing, in fact, is governments either not thinking for themselves or they're signaling something very dangerous, because the only thing that really unites multiple adjacent regions in the minds of policymakers is great power war and the preparation for great power war. So that's a lot. That's very heavy. Maybe explaining all that requires a little bit of context first. So I feel like maybe I should start off by offering a little background about how I come to study this and understand this topic. Because, I started life as a foreign policy practitioner in Washington before becoming a scholar. And then before that, I was serving in the US military. And that whole time, my early career, I was socialized into viewing US power in very conventional terms. So like traditional terms, I was taught to see the world through the lens of what we still kind of tend to call, liberal hegemony or liberal primacy, or if we want to be really euphemistic, it's like US leadership, quote unquote, right? And it was a view that was basically unfalsifiable. And it assumed that American power was a global public good. And to believe such a thing is a flat rejection of balance of power theory. It's a flat rejection of power balancing logic. But we didn't acknowledge that because we thought we were exceptional. We narrated our way around confronting how we were transgressing against the most basic logic of the balance of power. And by doing that, we didn't have to acknowledge the severity of our own hubris or narcissism. Like, we took for granted that US power was this mythical source of global stability and Asian security. You had Professor Joe Nye. He called us Asia's oxygen, right? Professor John Mearsheimer called us Asia's pacifier. And that view was beyond challenge. It was naturalized as if there could not be an alternative. And so this is what I'm saying to you is like, this is the way of seeing the world that was my reality while I'm working in President Obama's Pentagon during the day in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Mm-hmm. I'm doing my PhD. I'm getting exposed to research literature devoted to this empirical puzzle called the East Asian Peace. And all these scholars are analyzing the international relations of Asia to explain Asian security. And almost none of them were talking about US power. And the fact that they were overlooking US power was precisely the reason why they were analyzing an East Asian peace as if it did not include the Pacific. But the Pacific was also experiencing a period of relative peace in this same time frame. And so there was a clear gap between the way scholars thought about the Asian peace, which is really an East Asian and Pacific peace, and then the way that Washington policy practitioners and mainstream security studies scholars, the way they thought about the same phenomenon. And so this is back in like 2011, 2012. So I sat with this uncomfortable gap where, US policymakers were imagining that American power was necessary and sufficient to prevent war in Asia. And that clearly seemed wrong to me, right? But scholars of the Asian peace kind of had the opposite problem. Like they were mostly ignoring American power and focusing on things that were intrinsic to East Asia. So, and then this was leading them to like sort of wrongly talk about an East Asian peace as if it did not include the Blue Pacific, even though it kind of did. So I started to address this gap by writing the book that became Pacific Power Paradox, which came out last year. And what I argue in that book is kind of central to this lecture, because the Asian peace as an observable phenomenon has geographic boundaries. So what is the Asian peace? Well, it's a period of remarkable relative stability. As a measurement, it's the absence of new interstate wars in East Asia and the Pacific since 1979. But as an observable thing, like it does not include the Indian Ocean region. Why? Because the Kargil War between India and Pakistan in 1999, right? But that wasn't even the first clash between them, right? So in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean region, you had clashes that suggested that whatever accounts for the Asian peace does not apply to South Asia, does not apply to the Indian subcontinent. So when governments try to call the Indo-Pacific into reality, what they try to, when they try to make it the focus of their statecraft, what they're doing is erasing or overlooking a valuable empirical puzzle. So the Asian peace should be a very high priority for everyone, right? Because the Asian peace is an unquestionable public good for the region, for the world. And because of that, we should care about understanding what caused it. But by thinking about the region in a way that blurs the regional boundaries, policymakers are foreclosing on being able to align our statecraft with the sources that sustain the Asian peace. And in fact, I would go even further and say that the Asian peace is not even visible in a world where Asia has been subsumed into an Indo-Pacific. And the proof of that is that no government official who has ever used the term Indo-Pacific has ever even mentioned the Asian peace. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's because the Indo-Pacific is an antagonistic, exclusionary concept of region. And that's pretty ironic to have a regional concept so vast, covers most of the earth, it seems like, but it's also exclusionary, right? So the notion of peace is incompatible with the Indo-Pacific as policymakers describe it and operationalize it. Now, I should stress, like, the Asian peace has not been super peaceful. So during the same period since 1979, we all know the Korean War remained in a frozen armistice. For most of the 80s, Vietnam militarily occupied Cambodia. In the Philippines and parts of Southeast Asia, we've had brutal counterinsurgency campaigns, pacification campaigns. We have a lot of what peace scholars describe as structural violence in Asia and in the Pacific, because kleptocracy and oligarchy have been rampant. We've had civil wars. We have a civil war in Burma right now, right? And then we've had nuclear proliferation and nuclear crises that nearly ended the Asian peace, most acutely, obviously, with North Korea. So there's a way in which the Asian peace is a misnomer. Like, it's been peaceful. It hasn't been stable. And so the story of Asia, on some level, is the story of how, after a century and a half of recurring interstate wars and mass casualty violence, the period since 1979 has been remarkably stable by comparison. Mass casualty violence in Asia, it's actually going up right now, but it's dropped dramatically since 79. And there have been no new interstate wars since then either. And that story is not over. Like, we're in the hot, exciting, perilous middle of that story. We're in Act 2 or whatever, hopefully, or maybe hopefully we're in Act 1. I don't know. But, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, while we don't know what's going to happen because humans are terrible at predicting things, we have every reason to believe that we're barreling toward World War III. And the reason why war looks like it's in our future is that the sources of the Asian peace are eroding before our eyes. And as much as I hate to say it, it's the US that's a part of this problem of erosion. So historically, the Asian peace has been a layered peace, which is to say there's no single source of the peace. The peace has been kind of overdetermined, like multiple factors that have been sufficient individually to account for the peace, and yet we have all of them. And so among the various sources of stability since 1979, we see evidence, and this goes back to the Pacific Power Paradox book, we see evidence that US alliances and general deterrence have played a positive role sometimes and a negative role in other times. We see that economic interdependence and regionalism have been really important buffers against conflict, given that the Asian peace is something deeper than just the shallowness of avoiding war through manipulating fear, right? And then, of course, the most powerful source of the Asian peace has been the thing that nobody likes to talk about anymore, which was Sino-US détente. Like, it's not an accident that the Asian peace starts in 1979, and that's the same year that China and the US normalized diplomatic relations. So before détente, China had a revolutionary foreign policy. It was into military adventures in lots of places. It was extremely antagonistic to the US and US interests in Asia. But Deng Xiaoping needed cooperative relations with the US in order to reform the PLA, in order to prioritize national development over nationalist revanchism, right? And that's a similar bet that many Asian governments made in the same time frame, choosing development over, ethno-nationalism, that kind of thing. And so détente restrained China, but it also restrained the US in a way. It facilitated regional economic interdependence. It brought both great powers into regional institutions, and it literally directly helped stabilize the global economy after the 2008 financial crisis. And notably, all of this happened in a world where Asia was called Asia-Pacific, not Indo-Pacific, right? So what I'm saying is that a functionally cooperative relationship between the great powers has done more to preserve the Asian peace than any other factor. And this is why US foreign policy is actually a problem. Like, the biggest risk that we're taking against the Asian peace is that we have substituted détente for long-term rivalry. We've gotten rid of détente. We've brought in long-term rivalry. So this is the context within which to think about the Indo-Pacific and its implications. Like, the question that should occupy us from the perspective of regional stability is this: if we imagine Asia as an Indo-Pacific, what does that unlock? Is it unrelated and askew of war? Does the Indo-Pacific unlock the promise of peace in our time? Is it a threat to us all? Is it something else? Well, I've put my cards on the table already, I suppose. I have my opinion. I see the Indo-Pacific as antagonistic toward the Asian peace at the level of pure logic, because it obscures the Asian peace, right? But what we do in the name of the Indo-Pacific is really the practical issue. And that's also where we face serious problems. So nobody doubts that Indo-Pacific is a symbol of, so-called great power competition between the US and China. And maybe you don't remember this, I don't know, but during the Trump years, Trump's Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, he said that he wished to, quote, expand the competitive space with China in 2017. And only then did he begin referring to Asia as the Indo-Pacific. It was because it was a way of expanding the competitive space with China. For the Pentagon, for the Department of Defense, that's entirely what it's about and literally nothing else. And the Pentagon is, of course, the most well-resourced and lead agency within the US government, right? So it's also worth noting that like the only government department in the US to change all their Asia names, name the regional organizations, like change it to Indo-Pacific, throughout Department of Defense, you see that. But you don't see that at the State Department. I don't think you see that at Commerce. Last time I checked, USTR also didn't do it. CIA hasn't done it as far as I know, right? All those places are still, their policy offices are like Asia or East Asia or Asia Pacific, you know? And those elementary facts reinforce in the open what I've argued previously was a Washington subtext behind closed doors, which is that Indo-Pacific as a label functions as a shibboleth. It's coded language signifying efforts to contain Chinese power. And there's two complications, like there's two reasons, I suppose, that are like why that's not universally understood or universally known, right? There's two reasons why people fail to recognize this. One is that Indo-Pacific is a regional concept from history that fell out of use in the 20th century for very good reasons. And so sometimes when people talk about the Indo-Pacific, like especially scholars, they mean it in the older historical sense that has nothing to do with what is meant by Indo-Pacific today. Like one of my colleagues actually at Victoria University, Manjeet Pardesi, he does a bunch of like historical international relations research. He writes about the Indo-Pacific as a, turn of phrase that, yes, existed in the early 20th century amid Nazis, but also in the like 15th, 16th century, like way, way, way back, right? But those historical lineages have nothing explicit to do with what policymakers mean by it today. And then two, the other thing that complicates the meanings of the Indo-Pacific is that there is cooperation happening like today within the rhetorical framework of the Indo-Pacific. And so when you see governments propagandize about the Indo-Pacific, it's always focusing on some cooperative thing that governments are doing with other governments. But that's a little, the kids would say, sus, right? Not all cooperation is created equal. The valence, the color, the purpose of Indo-Pacific cooperation is part of forming geopolitical rivalry blocks. The Quad, AUKUS, to some extent, US, Japan, South Korea, trilateral cooperation. These are cooperative networks. You could even say that there are elements of like trust building that's happening within them. And in the Blue Pacific, you don't have a lot of trilateralism or minilateralism, but you do have an unprecedented amount of bilateral, quote unquote, security cooperation. But regardless of whether it's the Quad or Pacific bilateralism or whatever, we're talking about forms of antagonistic trust. That's not a good kind of cooperation necessarily. We're talking about the bond that forms between actors plotting against a common enemy and then trying to remake Asian and Pacific international relations to fit their image of great power competition. And that is incredibly poisonous as a trend, particularly if it's the only meaningful cooperation that's happening. Because cooperation that attempts to assert American primacy or that attempts to break up structures of economic interdependence, well, that's a kind of cooperation that is necessarily antagonistic to the Asian peace. And the fact that all of that kind of cooperation, the Quad, the AUKUS, that stuff, the fact that all of it is part of a great power competition construct means that all of this supposedly good cooperation is actually fueling an imbalance in the international system as the US tries to strategically encircle China, contain China's power, and then cut Asian and Pacific economies' ties to China over the long run. So to choose that stuff, any of it, is to choose rivalry over détente. So everything that we're doing as a region, even the countries that we see as the good guys, it's all bringing us closer and closer to regional war if it chooses to reinforce or amplify the forces of rivalry. And in our current historical moment, to embrace rivalry is to just flagrantly reject a real balance of power. It's to flagrantly reject the realities of how Asian political economy is structured. And so the region, whatever we call it, desperately needs new wagers for how to sustain peace. And peace will not come from loose talk about deterrence. It won't come from missile proliferation. Peace won't come from new military bases. And it will not come from economic nationalism or decoupling or de-risking or choose your euphemism, right? The sources of peace that we need are an inclusive regionalism, a new détente between the great powers, and above all, military restraint. And I don't see any of that coming under the label Indo-Pacific. I think Indo-Pacific signifies the opposite of all of that. And that's what we should be concerned about, in my view. I don't know how long I've been going, but I feel like I've probably run out of time here.
Then what you're saying is this, Indo-Pacific strategy is really wrongly construed in a grand strategy of the United States. Do you buy that argument? That's the wrong strategy.
Yeah, it's totally the wrong strategy. Weirdly, the Indo-Pacific strategy is the rare regional strategy that's a substitute for a grand strategy. So there's no, U.S. grand strategy is not, it is about primacy, but that's measured according to the standard of primacy in Asia or in the Indo-Pacific. So the strategy that policymakers come up with for the Indo-Pacific basically is the grand strategy. And I can't remember another time in US history, at least not in the past 70, 80 years, where we sort of reduced what our grand strategy meant down to a specific region, which is kind of strange. Yeah.
But still, this idea of Indo-Pacific strategy started with Obama administration, but it was very rare for Trump administration to succeed in Obama administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. What is your take on that continuity between the Obama administration to Trump administration?
Yeah, that's a good point. There is a tremendous amount of continuity. In fact, my mind started to change about all of this when I started seeing the very troubling continuities between Obama to Trump, and then even more so, the continuities from Trump to Biden. That's really, intellectually radicalizing in a way, because it's such an indictment, it's such a condemnation of almost everything we're doing. In the Trump years, I was part of this social milieu, this professional cadre of foreign policy people in the US. And I mean, physically, sometimes I was in New Zealand, but we were, time is a flat circle. I'm always back in DC and all this stuff. And thank God for Zoom. But we were freaking out about Trump era, Asia policy. We were freaking out about his excessive military spending, the expansion of the military budget, excessive nuclear modernization, right? Everything was about primacy and domination, and we publicly criticized him. All of us were on the record writing stuff criticizing Trump, and yet there was a lot, and I reconcile this in Pacific Power Paradox book, but Trump his Asia policy especially was not radically different from Obama's. His North Korea policy, it was deeply confrontational. In fact, the most different thing about Trump's Asia policy was the limited period of time when he was doing the summit diplomacy stuff. Because like Obama would never do that. Biden's never going to do that, But in general, the muscle flexing and the military spending and the nuclear excess, all of this stuff, this was Obama too. Now it's Biden is outbidding Trump. Biden is kind of out hawking Trump, especially on China. The North Korean nuclear problem is worse the past 3 years than it ever was under Trump, So the continuities are what really forced me to like question how much our narratives actually reflect reality. How much of the story that we tell ourselves as policymakers and as the good guys or whatever, how much does that actually reflect what's going on? Have we erased our own causal role in the threats to peace? We say that like we've had all like Korea is a great example. We have all these recurring crises with North Korea, and the way that this all gets like institutional memoried in Washington, it's like, well, North Korea did something bad, and then we ended up on the brink of war. North Korea did something bad again, and we ended up on the brink of war again. Do we not have agency here? Like, what is like North Korea driving the train? Like, what is this? International relations is inherently relational. Everything is interactive, and we claim to be the dominant power. We claim to seek that status still. That's like the driving force of our grand strategy. And so if we're this giant power in the region that casts such a long shadow, how is it that we are not responsible for any of the bad things that happen in the region? How are we innocent? Morally, causally, strategically, how are we innocent from the things that we don't like when other actors do things we don't like? And the fact that our narratives, our policies, and even a lot of times our analysis has no way to account for our own behavior and how it interacts with others, well, that really makes you rethink everything, But it started, to your point, it started with recognizing that there was a tremendous amount of continuity from Obama to Trump. And in hindsight, I mean, I was an Obama guy at the time, but in hindsight, we were very much on the wrong track. Ben Rhodes, Obama's deputy national security advisor, at that time, he confessed, he's like, the whole thing, this whole pivot to Asia, the whole point of it is to get America another 50 years as world leader. That was the point of it. That's a lost cause. Another 50 years as leader. Also, what does that mean? I mean, like, it just means primacy, right? It just means domination. Like, it's hard the idea that you would put all of your statecraft, all of your policy choices and resources in service of this visionary goal of get America another 50 years as leader, that's crazy. And that required us to do a lot more aggressive stuff. And then we handed all of that over to Trump, and Trump was a much more permissive environment for being openly antagonistic. At least Obama had some restraint when it came to rhetoric. He put on a face of appearing responsible, whereas Trump didn't care about appearing responsible at all. I think he probably thought it was a liability. And then Biden, now we have an administration that once again cares about appearing responsible, but is not focused on the sources of security versus insecurity. They're focused entirely on appearing responsible while doing literally nothing about the eroding sources of the Asian peace, doing literally nothing about North Korea. And then, to the extent they're doing anything in Asia in an active sense, it's the great power competition stuff, which I think is on the wrong side of the Asian piece.
Given your lecture, we can characterize the Indo-Pacific strategy in terms of three major strategies. First strategy is the geopolitical containment of China, Russia, even North Korea. Second strategy is geo-economic decoupling and de-risking, and creating kinds of exclusionary closed regional bloc. And third strategy is so-called the strategy for value alliance. In other words, the United States want to contain China and others like Russia and North Korea from coalition of democracy perspective. Do you think all these three strategies of Indo-Pacific initiative are they viable? Does America have a power and capability and resources to pursue those strategy?
That's a big question. I mean, they're pursuing that strategy now. The problem, I think, is that they lack the power position and the leverage to exercise the kinds of control that they used to be able to exercise, and they're still trying to do it anyway. And so the question for me is really, and so there's danger in trying to pursue a strategy that you lack the power to actually do. Like, that's a problem. That's dangerous. There's a way in which America is a danger to itself and others. And I don't want to suggest that other countries are not dangerous also, but the largest of these countries, America, is dangerous too. But that's not to say that America is all bad. Like, the Pacific Paradox book paints a pretty complicated picture. But the part of that picture that nobody ever talks about is the self-generated danger. And so the question for me, when it comes to the components of, like an Indo-Pacific strategy that you mentioned, where it's containment, economic exclusion and blocks, and, these certain alliances. For me, the question is like, does this help realize American national interests? Because any strategy that's not oriented toward the interests of your nation is going to be problematic or maybe even unsustainable. And that's also a problem for Indo-Pacific strategy. Like, if by national interests we mean the interests of everyone in America or almost everyone in America, then the current US strategy harms the national interest. Like, it supports the defense industry, it diverts money away from social spending, it doesn't actually resolve the climate crisis or address it in any meaningful way. And then ultimately, it's the poorest Americans who are disproportionately going to be enlisted in the war that eventually follows from all of this stuff, And when we impose tariffs on China, it's ultimately American workers and American farmers who pay for that, So when we insist on maintaining the dollar as the world's reserve currency, why do we do that? Well, we do that because it maximizes U.S. power in the international system. It's an asset for the national security state. But that status undermines the ability for America to export abroad, right? So what we're involved in is an intellectual dead end. We're not pursuing the national interest as understood in the sense of like the entire nation. We're just not. We're advancing narrow sectional interests of a select few within America, and then we're calling it national security, right? But if there was a truly inclusive version of the Indo-Pacific, that could be impressive, right? But it would have to support détente between China and the US, not rivalry between China and the US. So the previous, or two prime ministers ago in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, she embraced the Indo-Pacific language mostly because it felt like other governments were doing it too. And whenever you're a governing elite and you show up at some multilateral meeting with other governing elites, you don't want to feel awkward. And so if everybody's doing it, you do it too. It's like a group pressure, social pressure thing. But she gave a speech after she started being forced to use Indo-Pacific. She gave a speech where she basically said, look, when I think about the Indo-Pacific, I don't think about it like the rest of you guys. I think about it as something that's totally an inversion of competition. I think of it as an inclusive concept. I would like to take the cooperation that East Asia has achieved and expand it outward. Nobody listened to her. Nobody followed that model, but that was like the kind of use of Indo-Pacific that could be interesting, but like, I just haven't seen anybody go down that path.
One interesting phenomenon is this. During the period of Asia-Pacific AG, under American leadership, there was a peace, there was a common prosperity, and there was a civilizational coexistence among different cultural blocs in the region. But now, as a result of Indo-Pacific strategy, peace is being endangered, prosperity is being undermined, and there is a likelihood of crash of civilizations. Therefore, we are really concerned. Why the hell the U.S. is really sticking to this Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, the foreign policy cadre of the Democratic and Republican Party, so the career civil servants in government, but also the political appointees that come in, they live in their own information epistemic bubble, like their own reality of information. They talk to other people from other countries who are similar to them, which is other government officials, other governing elites, other cosmopolitan diplomats, and they're more like each other than they are like their fellow countrymen. And this is just a fact. Like, I've been in that world. There's nobody weirder in America than the professional class of diplomats and policymakers and think tankers. We're in our own universe. And I say that because they don't even think about a lot of the analysis I'm talking about, a lot of the history that would expose us as being on the positive and negative side of history. They just erase, that's not in their minds. They've cherry picked history, and that when they talk to other government officials in Sweden or even in South Korea or something, they get told what they want to hear. And that's part of being a diplomat, is like, you're the barbarian handler. You tell the foreigner Wenoms like what they want to hear, because it costs you nothing and you might get something out of it. But then that distorts your mind. You become detached from reality. I don't want to overstate this, and no offense if anyone on here is like a former diplomat, bunch of sociopaths, and that matters because this is a social milieu, a social network that is wholly unaccountable to the democratic will in any of these countries. Their foreign policy is notoriously a space where elites make choices, and then everyday people have to eat it. Everyday people don't get a say, except in the extreme moments of like the brink of war or something. But in terms of everyday stuff that's happening, when the gears are moving, when we're moving toward war, nobody gets a say in that. And so there's the unaccountability of the foreign policy space becomes a compounding problem when the people who are making choices about foreign policy don't think like their fellow countrymen, don't recognize reality, because they're all eating up each other's propaganda, this like homogenized knowledge base that doesn't reflect the real. And so they're living this very romantic life in their imagination while Rome is burning, and they're not making the connection between the domestic and the international. They still think like, oh, we're doing this great global project on behalf of the world. Yes, there's this thing where the Capitol got stormed by an insurrection. Yes, the president tried to throw a self-coup, but never mind that. They're so far divorced from reality. And that's separate from the power realities of Asia, like China is central to the production and value chain networks of Asian political economy. China is also like quite a large military power. And the idea that we're not going to accommodate them in any way, and in fact are going to antagonize them in every way, is just setting up the region for failure. And who gets a say in that? Who gets to have a voice in that? Basically nobody, except for these government officials who only talk to each other and are not accountable to the democratic will.
In your Pacific Power Paradox, you identified three phases of American power in the Asia Pacific. And first is aloof hegemon. Second is what is a vital bulwark. And third one is imperious superpower. What kinds of phase do you see in American pursuit of Indo-Pacific strategy now?
Oh, I think you know the answer to that. Actually, there's a little bit of all three, but the strongest face right now is the imperious superpower, I think. If the U.S. could start to demilitarize its presence in Asia, just overall, not necessarily in any specific place, if the military could become a subordinate part of strategy instead of the primary part of strategy, in that case, alliances could once again play a stabilizing role. But if U.S. alliances are simply part of a project for reestablishing military primacy in a region where it no longer has primacy, then the whole idea of like alliances and deterrence and great power competition and Indo-Pacific, it's all just excessive risk. And what troubles me is that U.S. policymakers are unable to see the risks that they cause because they view the region in this childlike, romantic way where we are an exceptional power and our power is an exceptional public good. So there's a way in which America continues to be an aloof hegemon as well because it doesn't recognize power realities in the region and it overstates the value of its own role.
Yeah, precisely. I think that America is deficient in overall capability. That is why the United States has been outsourcing its need to its allies and partners. In the United States trying to get the Korean, Japanese investment in the United States, and U.S. will be pushing hard pressures on Japan and South Korea and other allies and partners to increase their defense burden sharing and defense cost sharing, and etc. And I see growing contradictions between American capability on the one hand, the growing dependency on American allies and partners on the other. Do you think how the American government going to solve this contradictory problem?
Yes, it's very smart to identify that as a contradiction. Because if it's a contradiction, for one thing, it's probably not sustainable. So it's going to have to resolve itself in one direction or another direction. And then maybe that means it's a place where others can have a say, have a voice, have a choice. The contradiction part, the way this could resolve is that, especially in like a Trump administration, the U.S. just simply either extorts allies or it abandons them. And we saw signs of that in the Trump era already, right? But it was limited, it was contained, Trump got distracted or whatever. And so extortion or abandonment are like very possible futures, but in my mind, that's not even the worst possible outcome. The worst possible outcome is that allies are enlisted in this fracturing of regional order. They're enlisted on one side against the other side. And this is the path to every major war. the fracturing of order, one side against another side. And the alliances are not worth a damn if that's the outcome they produce. Because if they produce great power war and they get chain ganged, either allies get chain ganged into an American war or America gets chain ganged into an Asian war, those are both terrible outcomes, And so the idea that like we require our allies to do more in order to sustain our own primacy, this is not a situation that can last, and already in the American elite discourses, there's all kinds of unconventional, heterodox, non-traditional perspectives about foreign policy and about America's sort of role in the world that other countries just don't hear about. But the conversations and the debates are quite vibrant in Washington, and the government officials are not going to say that to the other government officials. But we're having like knockdown, drag out fights. I mean, even when I was just in DC a couple of weeks ago, part of what I was doing was fighting with a bunch of people, not literally. But and even some people on my own side sometimes, but there's like a much more eclectic imagination of like what we should do and what we could do. There's a lot more debates now, and most of it is against primacy. Most of it recognizes that primacy is both undesirable and unsustainable. And in some views, we've lost it already anyway. And so everybody's making different assumptions. Everyone has their own priorities, but the only people clinging to primacy is like 2.5 think tanks in Washington and the Biden administration. I mean, that's basically it,
The November election, suppose Trump get reelected, okay? Then, he has been, those people who are surrounding him have been suggesting that the Trump will continue Indo-Pacific strategy. At the same time, it is very likely that the Trump pursues the strategy of extortion and abandonment on the other hand. What do you see? Do you see any major changes in Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy if he gets elected in November?
It's a very good question. So I'm very worried about a Trump presidency. I think Asia should be worried too. But one of the ironies of the Biden years has turned out to be that 90% of Biden's Asia policy is Trump's Asia policy. And again, going back to the earlier discussion point, like to me, that's very discomforting, and it discredits a lot of the policy think tank expert people who focus on Asia because they have been completely co-opted by a really aggressive foreign policy agenda and a dangerous, unrealistic strategy. And under Trump, I mean, I imagine Indo-Pacific will still be the language that Washington prefers because it signals that competitive space. It's like we want the maximum amount of space to play the game of risk, and that's not so different from now, I suppose. But under Trump, you're going to probably see even more military spending, even more economic nationalism. I think Japan and South Korea in particular are going to be pressured into making some pretty large sacrifices. And what those sacrifices are, I'm not totally sure because it depends on, what side of the bed Trump wakes up on. But, during Trump's last term, his last term in office, he was already, basically trying to secure massive cash payments in exchange for nothing from South Korea and Japan, in exchange for the status quo, And one of the things that stopped him was that some of his policy officials opposed him at that time. But we know that, like MAGA, they have this 2025 plan now. It includes a loyal cadre of people who are just blindly faithful to whatever Trump wants and whatever the MAGA leadership wants. And so next time MAGA enters the White House, whether it's 2025 or later, they're going to bring a much more disciplined, loyal staff, and that's going to be a nightmare, and they might still call everything Indo-Pacific strategy, but it's like America first, America alone, allies are with us or you're out on your own. And then all the while, there's going to be a massive, massive confrontation over Taiwan. And we know that in part because some of the absolutely craziest human beings in Washington, like actual warmongers, were part of Trump's team before. They advised the Ron DeSantis presidential campaign now, who was basically a fascist in Florida. And they had him saying really crazy stuff about China. They've been saying really crazy stuff about China. And they want to do things that they say prevent war, but that are literally a self-fulfilling prophecy of war. And they're convinced of it. They're convinced that war is going to come. And so they've got to do everything now. And that's going to bring the war.
There is another paradox. The Biden administration has been very proud of strengthening alliance tie with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. And particularly Kurt Campbell has been very proud of such an improved alliance ties with its allies and partners in Indo-Pacific. But look at the popularity, approval rate of Prime Minister Kishida, approval rate of President Yoon Suk-yeol, approval rate of President Marcos Jr. They are all the teens and 20s, very low in a popular support in those countries. That means what? There is a very fragile domestic support base for the alliance with the United States. How is the United States going to handle this kind of problem?
That is a super interesting observation. So because right-leaning governments everywhere are pretty unpopular right now, including in New Zealand, we happen to have one right now too, incidentally. And yet these same right-leaning unpopular governments are pushing much more aggressive foreign policy agendas, like all of them, 100% of them. But who benefits from that? Like, the term, 친일파, from like World War II. There's like 친미파, like it's like being a sycophant to power and then pushing forward right-wing ethno-nationalist agendas in many cases, but wearing a mask while you're doing it that says, oh, we're just a good U.S. ally. It's just traditional partner. It's just American hegemony, et cetera, right? But as you say, there is no popular support for most of what our governments are doing in foreign policy. None of this stuff is the will of the people. It's generally, and like I said, it's generally the case that like democracies are fairly unaccountable on foreign policy and that's converging with this historical moment where that unaccountability is being exploited to push aggressive, distracting, diversionary, nationalistic, and over-militarized foreign policy agendas. And these things do not have a popular base of support because they're not smart, they're not realistic, they're not necessary. And when you do aggressive things in foreign policy, who pays? It's the working classes and the majority in civil society who end up having to pay the price for that. The policymakers themselves, I know this because I was one, are never the ones who pay the price for that, for the bad judgment, So one hopeful thing, I think, if I'm trying to be optimistic, because I feel like I've been very pessimistic today, one hopeful thing is that if these current governments are really as unpopular as the polling suggests, 17% approval, 20% approval, if that's correct, then at some point their opposition will be elected. And then that opposition, when it comes to power, has a chance to embrace a more sane, rational, hopefully militarily restrained foreign policy. And whatever we might call that sane, non-crazy approach to foreign policy, I doubt we'll call it Indo-Pacific strategy, you know?
My last question. 100 years ago, a German geographer and a Nazi strategist, Karl Haushofer, wrote a book, Geopolitics of the Pacific. In that book, he argued that Japan should pursue Indo-Pacific strategy to counter Western colonial domination in Indo-Pacific, led by the UK, France, Netherlands, and even the United States. And in 2007, and it is generally believed that then Prime Minister Abe Shinzo quoted from Hofhauser's Indo-Pacific strategy, and he began to popularize the concept of Indo-Pacific strategy. And then this Abe's idea of Indo-Pacific strategy was transmitted to the Obama administration, and it was officially adopted as American strategy in Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region. What is your take on this intellectual origin of Indo-Pacific? Do you think that the American policymakers were aware of that the intellectual origin of the Indo-Pacific strategy coming from Nazi Germany, Karl Haushofer?
That is a genius question. Brilliant. And I think the general answer when the question is, was America aware of something, history, something? The answer is always no. So that's just part of the American insistence on its own innocence. Like, in order to be innocent, you have to not know history. So that's how that works. This is a seriously good question though, because the Nazi geopolitical thinking about Indo-Pacific and the way Indo-Pacific used to function as a euphemism for the Japanese empire's, the quote unquote, greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, that's an origin story that we should be sensitive to, especially if Abe Shinzo is quoting Haushofer, So the people who talk about Indo-Pacific these days, except for a couple of Trump people, they're not Nazis, but the genealogy is important because Haushofer's theorization, his concept was that Japanese empire could be a counterbalance to white supremacist empire. And I got introduced to this by way of W.E.B. Du Bois, a Black American scholar back in the day, one of the great IR scholars in America, in fact. And he made a similar argument in the 1920s about maybe Japanese empire is a bulwark against white supremacist empire. But he changed his mind. He recanted. He was like, that was wrong, right? Once he saw what Japanese empire was doing to the Korean people, to the people in Manchuria, right? When he saw that what the violence of empire, he realized that empire versus empire is no kind of solution. But what that shows, the reason, and that's why he changed his mind later, and he's like, I was wrong. Japanese empire is not a good thing, right? But the reason I bring it up is because there was a scholar named Moishe Pastone. I'm probably messing up his name, but he argued that spatial analysis tends to favor reactionary politics. It tends to reproduce insecurity, right? So when you think about security in a divisible way, which is what geographic boundary making does. It divides things, right? When you do that, you almost always end up making insecurity worse. And at a minimum, the US, Japan, Australia, they're the main advocates of Indo-Pacific. At a minimum, they have a responsibility to be thinking critically about how precisely their vision of the Indo-Pacific is different from what Haushofer imagined, what the Japanese empire imagined. But you have to acknowledge the historical linkage in order to deal with it. And we haven't acknowledged the historical linkage. And this is, again, the problem of American exceptionalism, the problem of self-exculpation, the problem of moral innocence, means that we can't see reality for what it is. We read history in a way that's extremely self-serving, and this is the source material for future tragedies. This is how we end up having such horrible judgment in the world of foreign policy. So I think this is like a very important question, because I would love for Kurt Campbell to answer a question about how the Indo-Pacific as a competitive space is different from what Haushofer imagined. You know, does he even know who Karl Haushofer was? Like, I don't know.
Anyhow, let me correct one of my statements. Prime Minister Abe did not quote from the Karl Haushofer, but it is generally believed that the Prime Minister Abe was influenced by Karl Haushofer's work, because that Geopolitics of Pacific was translated in Japanese in 1940s, just about the time that Japan pursued the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. Therefore, let me correct on that point. Now, let's go to the flow. We'll take questions and comments from the floor. I see Professor Lee Hae-jung is there, right? Professor Lee of Chungang University. He's one of the leading strategists in South Korea. He's very good at the intellectual history of American foreign policy. Professor Lee, are you there? I saw your name. Okay, who else? Raise your hand. You know how to use the post. Charles Yun, please go ahead. Would you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, I'm actually a graduate student at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, and then but I follow Professor Jackson. So
yeah, good to see you.
Yeah, finally. This is more of a comment than a question, but it seems like everything you've been talking about has to do with like political psychology, right? We're all cognitive misers. We all have bounded rationality. We can't really think in complex ways. So it seems like the problem is that the narrative of US versus China is so entrenched that there's not really going to be a change, whether it's Democrat or Republican or whoever, until that narrative changes. And that narrative is it's deeply entrenched right now. And according to Professor Jeffrey Legro, the only ways that kind of grand strategy or policy changes is when something goes wrong, right? And then people start to assess, okay, this policy is not working. So I guess one of my questions is, do you think that this deterrence that is kind of hypnotized everyone, makes everyone think that, okay, there's no problem, everything's safe, and therefore we don't have to worry about it? Or is it, and it's also just partly that the elite consensus, the blob in DC is just, they just have cognitively just closed off any other possibilities?
So yeah, that's a good question. I do think that the consensus nature of this, of great power competition itself, of the way American foreign policy elites think about security and stuff, this is makes it way harder for anybody who's a kind of dissident thinker or a contrary, anybody who has like a bright idea that's other than the status quo. In an environment of consensus, their ability to maneuver or advocate for alternative viewpoint is like zero. I mean, like they can't do it, And so the narrative does have to change in order to unlock better policy options. That is totally the case. The one thing that Jeff Legros, I don't know how many people are familiar with this book. I forget what it's called, but it's a very good book from like the early 2000s about how ideational change happens in foreign policy or whatever, because it doesn't happen very often. And he had like a very kind of simple way of like, well, there has to be some sort of shock in the system or something, and that disrupts the status quo. There's one alternative source of hope, though, of change, which is that like any consensus that is held by elites and elites only does not have popular support. So if there's ever a transformation of who the governing elites are, or if governing elites decide suddenly it's in their interest to obey the democratic will, in those cases, the consensus becomes illegitimate. It becomes like a source of a problem that must change. So the fact that an elite consensus holds is only powerful as long as it's those same elites who are in power. So there's actually hope in the fact that like stuff like great power competition is not popular.
Next question. 누구지? Thomas. Okay, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tom, a PhD candidate at Monash University in Melbourne. Thanks for the talk, it was really interesting. Professor Jackson, I wonder if you could unpack what you mean when you say the Indo-Pacific is an exclusionary concept, because I think it's like an important thing to challenge, but it comes along with the US shifting the way they talk about the region and talking more about like a lattice work of alliances. And alongside that, you kind of see European countries increasingly pulled into the region. And I think like loads of European countries now have Indo-Pacific strategies. And say in the British context that I work in, you increasingly see people talk about the indivisible Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions, which in some ways builds on the kind of geopolitical imaginaries of someone like Halford Mackinder or the British imperial era. So I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, spatial analysis lends itself to reactionary politics. That's what we're seeing. You know, this like it's our security is indivisible, but only within this sphere. It's highly divisible with everybody else who can go to hell. You know, like that's we can set the world on fire so long as we have built a ring around ourselves, and like that is not that's not any way to exist in an Earth that we all inhabit together. First of all, but on Indo-Pacific as an antagonistic construct, I mean like. It's exclusionary in multiple senses. So it's exclusionary in the sense that it's targeted toward China and does not include China and will never include China the way it's deployed, you know, but also the forms of cooperation like Quad and AUKUS. I think these things are not super important in and of themselves, but they are exclusionary as well. It's ring-fenced cooperation. You know, if you're the Quad, you get to be in whatever that circle is, and then that's it, and nobody else. Maybe you engage with one other person on the outside. If you're AUKUS, by definition, it's 3 countries. You know, Kurt Campbell likes to promise things to lots of people, and so there's certain allied governments. Again, this monolithic hive mind of cosmopolitan diplomats or whatever, all sort of reading out of the same script. And so, if America's doing it, then maybe we should do it too. Oh, they said Indo-Pacific, so we should say Indo-Pacific. Oh, they have an Indo-Pacific strategy. Maybe we need an Indo-Pacific strategy. It's like Veep or like Yes Minister. Like this is it's a joke. But yes, so all to say is like in these concepts of security and the concept of the Indo-Pacific are in relation to China, just as rules-based international order is a concept that's in relation to China. And like Kyle Laskeretz had this book a few years ago called Orders of Exclusion. And he basically argued that going back to, 1815, every version of international order that was constructed by great powers was exclusionary. Every rule, whatever they called it, Edwardian Empire, liberal international order, rules-based order, League of Nations even, all of it was exclusionary toward an individual nation or toward an ideology that they feared, right? So it was all about like responding to threats, perceived threats in an exclusionary way. So, and that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing again now in real time.
Who raised a hand? 심영덕. She got admission to University of Wisconsin and PhD program with a full 5-year full scholarship. Anyhow, Youngdok, okay, you raise a hand. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'm a fellow at the East Asia Foundation. I did research under Professor Chung-In Moon, and thank you for the lecture. It's been a really interesting lecture. My question is, it's more I guess it's more from the mainstream side. And I guess it's probably from more of the conservative, South Korean conservative foreign policy circle side. And my question is basically, when we talk about great power balancing, such as when the U.S. tries to enclose the Chinese, I think one of the common things that occurs is that we tend to overlook the interests of the small powers. And I've kind of noticed that within the U.S.-Russia balancing debate, when we talk, the critics of NATO expansion basically talk about how, it's the U.S. unilaterally trying to enclose Russia, when in reality, I think it's a lot more complex in that, a lot of the Baltic states wanted U.S. involvement in the region because of like historical, invasions and misdoings by the Russian Empire. So I think perhaps I'm just being a devil's advocate today because just thought it could be an interesting kind of debate. But
Yeah.
kind of using that idea, applying that in the East Asia, Indo-Pacific region. Because a lot of the analysis, if anything, a lot of the conventional argument is that if anything, these Asian states like Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines, they kind of want the U.S. to be more involved in Asian geopolitics because of the sort of the objective expansionistic kind of Chinese aggression under Xi Jinping. I mean, we see that. I don't know if you've read the book, but in Clive Hamilton's Silent Invasion, it could be exaggerated, but they talk about how
I'm
the
not
communists,
a fan, but yeah.
the CCP kind of the intrusion in Australian society, and just the Chinese sort of like military buildup in the South China Sea, and just the espionage operations going on. So, what is your stance on the argument that if anything, the Asian states kind of want U.S. sort of military balancing within the region in order to kind of balance, to kind of deter the objective Chinese aggression within the region? And if that is the case, what do you think about the whole idea that small power interests should be sort of incorporated within the great power balance debate?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a good question, and there's a lot of part of the reason why it's good is there's a lot of problems with it. So there's many angles on which to address this. One, the conservative interests in military antagonism are not in the interest of their publics. Okay, so like when we talk about what does this country think, what does South Korea think, or what is Japan's interest? Well, who's channeling that, right? And like you mentioned the Philippines as being extremely favorable toward more American military intervention in Southeast Asia. Yeah, right now, because of the current extremely unpopular president combined with a PLA, People's Liberation Army China, that's like somewhat rogue, like Xi Jinping has given them quite a long leash to be like pretty aggressive in the South China Sea, and that was also the case under Duterte. But Duterte, who was also, I have no love for Duterte, but he was also democratically elected, and his position on America was pretty clearly the opposite of all of this, right? So this is why it matters when like Professor Moon was talking about the sort of ridiculously low approval ratings of these governments that are stewarding fairly irresponsible foreign policies. That's to me, that's not a coincidence, like you're not reflecting the larger democratic will, and you happen to be extremely unpopular according to the democratic will. That makes sense, but in a tragic kind of way. So we have to be careful about who we say is representing the interests of smaller powers, because the interests of smaller powers would clearly be served by inclusion, peace, prosperity, and military restraint on all sides. We get not much restraint from China, but we also don't get much restraint from the US, you know? So like I was saying to Professor Moon before we started this, like sometimes my analysis, you know, finds an audience in China, and sometimes they absolutely hate me, you know, it depends. But the reason is because I'm intellectually honest here, and I'm willing to see that international relations is relational. So I can recognize that like China engages in behavior and foreign policy, especially that like I find extremely problematic. And yet I don't think China is seeking to dominate. I don't think they can. And I think that if a more restrained version of America would be quite a natural, organic kind of counterbalance to that. But the other thing is that conservative interests, especially like national security states and these different governments, they talk about balancing. And you mentioned balancing too, balance of power, right? Well, America, in everywhere except the Taiwan Strait, America has the greater share of the balance of power. The balance of power is favorable toward America. Almost nobody contests that, right? In Taiwan, it's a complicated picture because it's literally off the coast of mainland China. It's just like, how are we going to have a favorable balance of power in China? It doesn't make sense, you know? But like the balance, to talk about balancing is a category error. It's a misnomer. Balance of power theory suggests that smaller states work together to balance the stronger state. Who's the strongest state with a presence in this region? It's not China, it's America. China's accumulating military power disturbingly fast, but it's doing so from a position of inferiority in the balance of power. So if we're concerned about like hegemony or domination or something like that, we have to recognize that an equilibrium of power is better for stability, and an equilibrium means not an extreme concentration of power in the global metropole. You know, America has a lot of slack, a lot of margin to reduce its military power or to bridle it and restrain it in ways that could build confidence and shape international relations in a favorable direction, which is what would be in the interests of smaller powers, because then they don't have to die in great power wars. They don't have to become sites for proxy conflict, you know? Like the argument makes itself, I think. And so I think that thinking about inclusion, peace, regionalism, restraint, and thinking relationally about how we can achieve those things is centering the smaller powers. It's not centering the conservative elite interests within these smaller powers, but it is centering the smaller powers. That's what I would say.
Okay, Van, thank you very much. Let us give a big applause to Professor Van Jackson. And it was wonderful for us to have your revisionist thinking or critical thinking, because we have been so well tamed by mainstream conservative thinking, but today you gave a really refreshing ideas and thought on international relations. Again, let us give a big applause to Professor Jackson, and we'll be in touch with you. Thank you, Van. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everybody.